I'm assuming you all can see that. My session today is really linking on from Cheek-ins and looking at another sort of form of payment that we're all very familiar with, and that's really on credit cards. And the topic of the presentation is really on how we can actually protect ourselves in the digital era, in the current era where COVID-19 risks are prevalent from fraudulent activities. So just to set the context, and sort of talk really around the topic of fraud and how that's a problem for us, not just in Singapore, but globally. But it might not be surprising to hear that scams are actually on the increase globally, meaning more and more people are actually falling victim to scams and fraudulent schemes. Now, to put some numbers on this, and this is very much from a global credit card fraud or card fraud aspect, global card fraud losses have hit $27 billion. US dollars, and the forecast and the trend that we can expect to see if we don't really improve how we tackle fraud collectively is that is expected to hit 40 billion over the next few years. And to put things into context, that is just over 10% of the Singaporean economy. Global fraud, credit card fraud is actually is projected to kind of hit the tune of that kind of magnitude. So a very, very severe problem for us. What we've also seen is that fraudsters have been able to adapt quite quickly to the COVID situation, and have actually really looked to prey on people's sort of anxieties and adapt their scams to improve their chances of getting information that they will need to actually conduct some fraudulent transactions, which we'll be talking a little bit more about in the presentation. So overall, we really need to remain vigilant to avoid being scammed, and I'm hopefully going to be presenting some tips that will help us to kind of stay safe in this environment from a fraud perspective. So I really want to sort of elaborate on what to look out for. So how do fraudsters operate? And there are different mechanisms and schemes out there in terms of the operation, but one of the key things I want to sort of really cover is where we're actually contacted. And there's three key stages to a fraud if you actually really boil it down. The first is the fraudster has to make contact. You have something that the fraudster actually needs to get hold of in order to conduct a fraudulent transaction. And the key thing here is that the fraudster is really looking at different channels to make that contact with people. So that will include phone calls, it can include SMSs, and it can also be on emails as well. And if you taking these one step at a time, what does that actually mean when a fraudster is trying to contact us through one of these channels? Phone calls will usually involve fraudsters or scammers trying to obtain a credit card details over the phone. So that's the key channel that they're actually using through conversation, through convincing people that they're someone that they're not, and trying to get some sensitive credit card details. And Cheek-in sort of talked about the one-time password because that's required. But the key intention there is how the fraudster can actually get that information with someone that's unsuspecting a phone call, but gets a phone call and is actually duped into providing that. The second sort of channel is really where SMSs or emails. Cheek-in also talked about, unsuspecting links or suspicious links. The key thing there is to fraudsters will actually send out potentially en masse SMSs and emails that will entice you to actually click on those, and they could be malware. It could actually be leading into another page or actually presenting something that seems too good to be true. Fake purchases, discounted products, the availability of products that are difficult to get. We saw earlier on in the COVID situation when that was hitting various different markets that masks were in a shortage, and we saw fraudsters quickly adapting to portray themselves as sellers of masks, so to try and encourage people to sort of buy these products, but they're obviously fake and as a false incentive. And there's two types of ways that the fraudsters can actually come and target us. One can be just general mass communication, so blanket SMSs, blanket emails in the hope that someone would actually click the links that are there. or it can be very targeted. So Cheekin in the earlier presentation sort of alluded to social engineering or phishing. This is where someone actually looks at an elaborate scheme and tries to do some research on you to really find out a little bit more about your detail in a way that they can actually use those details to sound very convincing, and really get an individual to hand over some credit card or any other sensitive banking information. So the second aspect really is what I've sort of termed as a hustle. This is a key thing where the fraudster is actually looking to do to convince an unwitting person to actually click on a link or to actually hand over some details. And we have seen quite a wide array of these elaborate schemes developed and used to unfortunately defraud Singaporeans and elsewhere. And these can actually be, you know, a variety of things. So we've seen, and the MOH has actually sent out quite a lot of information on this also, but we've seen individuals that are, you know, pretending to be representatives from those government agencies, and looking to sort of, again, try and convince individuals to hand over some credit card details or any other sort of personal banking details, or they can sort of portray themselves as bank representatives, or you can actually put anything in there. But the key thing is that the individual is really looking to maximize their success rate at getting credit card information. That's the end game. Now, as part of that, as I mentioned previously, there will be requests to hand over some information, which will include the one-time password. And the other aspect, other than phone calls, is really the elaborate design of advertisements, and also on other sort of promotional activities that are designed in a way to make them look legitimate. But the key thing is these all would actually portray something that would appeal to someone, because it's very difficult to either source that product, or it's coming at a price, or it's some sort of incentive to win something, to win vouchers, to win cash, that you know, people unfortunately do fall for. But in other words, it can be too good to be true. So once the fraudster has actually come up with the contact details, once the communication channels are there, the scheme has been set, then it's really about execution. It's really about sort of working through those channels to try and contact individuals, sometimes on scale, to get as many of these details as possible. And the third aspect really is the final stage. The fraudster will have the credit card details, the fraudster will have the OTP. Sometimes, well, you know, an unwitting person is on the phone thinking they're talking to, you know, a government official or talking to the bank representative. Sometimes these purchases are made while that customer's or while that individual's actually on that call, and so therefore the aim for the fraudster is really to maximize in a short space of time the spending or the purchase of goods that are shipped elsewhere, obviously, which can then be sold, and obviously the receipts and the proceeds of those sales going to the fraudsters. So these things can happen at a very short space of time, and the fraudsters are really looking to be one step ahead of the banks before the banks can actually detect something's fishy is going on with the account, to try and make sure that within a short space of time they're really maximizing the usage of that card and trying to extract as much money as possible from that particular scheme. Now, banks, as I mentioned, sometimes you know, banks have systems in place around monitoring of accounts, but sometimes, you know, not all instances, should I say, are banks really alerted, and therefore, you know, we're able to stop these you know, fraudulent cases from occurring. But the intention is definitely there. The monitoring's there as an ongoing basis, but sometimes you know, things slip through the net, and unfortunately some people experience some losses. So moving on, in terms of how can we protect ourselves and prevent these from occurring, I think the best bit of advice I can really give, if it's on a phone call, is to really take the person's details, the name, the details of that person, the contact number, and sorry, not the contact number, the department that they're from, and look for an independent way to verify that. So as most basic or simplest term, that would be calling back the bank, calling back the department, using a number, and this is very important, using a number that you have searched yourself on Google, not a number that the person's actually given you on the phone, because that can be part of the scam. So the key thing is, if someone's claiming to be, say, for example, from the MOH, and they're asking for credit card details or any other banking details, the best thing to do is really to take the person's name and go onto the website, get the actual details of the MOH's number and contact them themselves to actually verify that all the details and everything that was said in the phone is correct. So I think that's the key bit of advice I can really give, is to do some independent verification yourself. Put the phone down. You're not going to really miss out on much. It's really a case of just protecting yourself from anything that's illicit. Be wary of suspect emails and links claiming to be from e-commerce companies. Again, if you cannot find that link independently through a Google search, it may be too good to be true. It may be something that is not necessarily legitimate. And also look at the detail, if you can look at the URL or the link details, sometimes that's a bit of a giveaway as well, because it may look unusual. It may sort of, we're expecting to go on a Redmark website or a Lazada website, and the details will be completely different. So always, look at actual link details to see if anything's suspect before you actually click on anything at all. And the last point really is, be wary of items which are too good to be true. Again, this is all part of the scheme to try and solicit and dupe individuals to hand over details. So elaborate schemes will be sort of developed in a way for them to actually sound legitimate and try and get some unsuspecting individuals to hand over details. So really be wary of that. And one thing, it's common sort of rule of thumb that I tend to use, that if it's too good to be true, it probably is a hustle. It probably is something that's more illicit and murky going on in the background. A couple other things to sort of just to really cap off on things on credit cards, just for some really more from informative purposes. Your credit cards, in terms of how they're used for processing payments, it can be through two different mechanisms. And many of you may have seen credit cards that have a little silver rectangle on the face of it. That's really the chip. And that's really the information that's used to communicate back with the bank, etc., and really authenticate that transaction. But if you turn over the credit card, there's also a black stripe, that's the mag stripe. And that can also be used for making payments. The key thing to note is that when you're actually going abroad, sometimes when you're using your credit cards in different terminals or different stores, not all places will have an actual a device that allow the chip card to be read, and therefore they'll be swiped. Always be kind of wary of that, because it's very easy for skimming devices or any other device for that magnetic stripe, the information contained in it, to be replicated onto another card and the card cloned. So we do, in Singapore, we do have to activate our card for overseas usage, which means that if you are going to a location and using our card that's been activated and they don't have a chip terminal, we could be sort of placing ourselves at risk, because those details can be extracted and can be cloned for other purchases. Now, one of the ways that the banks have, and the card operators have, these are really the scheme operators, Visa and MasterCard and what have you, but one of the mechanisms out there to protect consumers is really a chargeback process. And that really works if you detect a transaction that you've not really made. The key thing is to call the bank that's issued your credit card, and the bank will actually work through a chargeback process where the merchant or the seller of the actual good or product that's in dispute, their bank account, well, there'll be an investigation that will be taking place, and if it's found to be a legitimate case, that transaction will be reversed. So at the end of the day, the consumer will be made good. But there are certain limitations around that in terms of timeliness, in terms of what kind of circumstances you can use a chargeback. So the best thing to do is obviously remain vigilant and to contact the bank as soon as possible if there is anything suspect on your statement that you can see. And that leads me on to the last point, which is really the important piece of actually looking to monitor your credit card statements very closely. And when you're actually monitoring your credit card statements very closely, it's not always going to be big ticket items that is going to be the case. Sometimes there will be small tester payments that will be made that you might not pick up. And these things can be on iTunes. It can only be for a handful of dollars, but the scamster, the fraudster, will be really looking to test the credentials of the card and then look to sort of do larger scale transactions over and above you know, what's been put through already. So the key thing is to really make sure that you're scrutinizing credit card statements and alerting your bank for anything that's suspect or dubious. So just to cap things off in terms of do's and don'ts, a quick sort of checklist to run through. That's quite straightforward. Do monitor your credit card statements closely and transactions closely, and report any suspect transactions to your bank. Report your lost or stolen card to your bank immediately. This is really important. To the timeliness aspect is really important. Time is really of the essence here. So do contact your bank. There are emergency contact numbers that are available that you can actually get in touch to cancel the card, block the card, and your bank can issue another card to you immediately. Exercise caution when enrolling your card for overseas usage. As I mentioned, that does present some higher risks, particularly if you're traveling to markets that don't use the chip function of the credit cards. Couple of things to sort of not do. Well, the first is do not in any circumstance, as a simple rule, never give out the details of your one-time password. There will not be any circumstances where a legitimate caller would ask for those details, and that should be a real red flag if someone's actually asking for your one-time password on a phone call or through any other communication channel. And the final thing is not to store any credit card information online, and do not transact with any websites which look authentic, because they could be a front for other scams that are happening in the background. And that brings then to my presentation.